Okay, welcome. I'm Nora Mitchell. I'm helping out by moderating this session and to support our presenter, William Hardaway. Um, I'll just cover a little bit of business first. We are recording this, so the session recordings will be available to everyone after today. The Zoom captions are on, so if you want to use that option, it's available in the bottom bar. Feel free to put questions into the chat, and our presenter will also use chat. So chat will be a window to pay attention to. Let's see. Anything else? I think that's it. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our presenter, William Hardaway from Fresno State University, and he'll be presenting on building a community of practice around equity-minded pedagogy. So go ahead and introduce yourself and welcome.
Hello, everyone. My name is William Hardaway. I am an instructional designer here at Fresno State. And uh, basically, what that means is I help faculty design curriculum and course elements, specializing in equity mindedness in the classroom. And I'm also currently teaching a system wide. So, the California State University system is about 23 campuses. I'm currently teaching a system wide version of a course that I designed for our campus. And we're on our fifth cohort, third system wide, where we have uh, all of our campuses go through a community of practice centered around equity minded pedagogy. So basically, I'm going to talk to you about the origins of that work and what some of the outcomes have been. And hopefully, through that, there's some takeaways you can keep with you. There are some strategies you can utilize, and we'll see where we go. So my pronouns are he, him, his. I'm an instructional designer, and my experiences. I started in student affairs and in advising, and then eventually in learning assistance. And so I had like a 14-year career there. And then my research is really in uh, creative problem solving as a means of addressing inequities in higher ed, um, a term that I like to call culture driven design is the approach that I take. I'm also a member of the National Coalition Building Institute, where we do full day anti-racism workshops as like a core offering, but we do many other things as well. But the reason why I want to highlight those full day workshops is because they are with faculty, staff, students, administrators, and community members. And for the most part, the demographics are ranging from like 20 to, I think I did a workshop a few weekends ago. We had some members that were in the 70 plus club, all from our campus. And typically in those spaces, it is folks' first time talking about their specific experiences and learning about the specific experiences of others around oppression and privilege. My focus and commitment is on decolonizing creative decision making, which a lot of the decisions that we make in higher ed are creative, and then co-creating solutions with those most impacted. This is a picture of Wesley Chapel School, 1921. Number 7 is my great grandfather, who I'm named after. Um, this school was started by my great great grandfather because folks in our community, this was before separate but equal, folks in our community did not have a school to go to at all. And so this school was started. My dad, my uncles, and my aunt, they all graduated from there. It went up to I think sixth grade, and the older kids would be in the same classroom as the younger kids, and there was one teacher, but it was like a each one teach one type of philosophy. So there's just like one of the things that I always like to focus on is that everything around us has been designed. So this couch that I'm sitting on, this phone, of course, this phone was designed so recently that we understand um, some of the like design background, design decisions that went into it. Higher education was in kind of like the Americanized instance of it was developed out of the 13 colonies. And so you could imagine women weren't allowed, people of color weren't allowed. It was a system, a dormitory based system for white Protestant males. And so, and then, of course, a lot of innovations came out of that kind of experiment, right? The institution of deanships, dorms, how classes are structured, and we didn't necessarily leave a lot of those practices as we inherited and evolved throughout the years. And so it's just always something that I like to point out, that we have come on a long journey, but we haven't made all considerations for what needs to change, what needs to adapt. And that's just been true in the literature for the last 30 years as the demography of institutions has been getting more diverse. So, the intersection of creativity, oppression, and justice. So, folks are typically born into statistics that other people observe. My story is no different. I'm the only man in my family that didn't do time in prison, and it wasn't like I grew up and I wasn't expecting to go, or I was expecting to go. It was just always taught to me that this is an inevitability, and be prepared. And so when I graduated high school, I knew far more about the prison system and what to do there than I knew about like a higher ed institution. And so I ended up enrolling in a community college when I came to vacation and see my sister for a while. And that was just through networking with some guys that were on the track team that lived just below her, and I went to campus with them a few times just to hang out. And everybody around me just encouraged me, like, why don't you, start to take classes and do this and that. And so that's my journey to into higher education. I never left. My professional journey has been around human centered design, and my start was like during the housing bubble. So I had just graduated with my bachelor's degree. I decided to go into education, and so I was doing advising work, and then I had transitioned into a position in learning assistance, and I had maybe been like 8 9 months on the job, so past my probationary period. But when the housing bubble burst, it was we went into furloughs. There were significant layoffs, and the thought was that there's going to be more layoffs. And the advice that I got from my mentors was be prepared, because this is a possibility. And so when I thought like, okay, I worked all the way through college and I finally decided that I wanted a career in education, and now that's not possible anymore. So what do I do? And so I started teaching myself industrial design, planning to eventually go back to get like an art degree, because when I was younger, I did do a lot of art. And design and industrial design stood out to me because of the practices of just creating a product and creating a service. And so luckily I didn't end up losing my job during that time. And so what happened was I had this whole new skill set and approach to thinking. And so I started utilizing that in my role in higher ed. And then when I went on to get my master's, that's specifically what I studied and wrote my thesis on. Um, So the anti-racism workshops that I conduct, they're across the campus. They're with administrators, staff, faculty, students. One thing that I noticed there, and what led me to my research was we cover things like internalized depression. Um, we caucus around the question of what do you never again want people to say, think, or do toward you and your group, and we have different identity groups come up and give those statements. We engage in identity mapping at the beginning of the workshop, and then we teach skills for how do you disrupt a prejudicial remark, joke, slur, and then we also teach the skill of how do you build community to advocate for social justice. One thing that I noticed in those experiences, though, is right. It's one full day. Everybody just has this immense experience, and they feel empowered, and they have a lot of awareness. Then most folks that I see a couple months later, they're like, "Yeah, I'm still aware. I'm noticing more. I feel more connected to people, but in my department or in my unit, I do not have power to make change." So I make change where I can, but ultimately there's some really there's some structural things that are going on that I just don't feel like I have the power to change. And so that's where my interest in my research started was you build these small communities and you hope that they can go out and disseminate change, but a lot of times that's not possible. And what we're learning in the community of practice for faculty right now is that a lot of faculty are like, I can't show up for my students in this way because I'm being oppressed in my own department or in my own institution. And so a lot of my research was centered around like how do we um, build space for folks to engage in incremental change around institutional oppression. So how might we make more inclusive and equitable classrooms? And so when I took my position as an instructional designer, I was kind of challenged to come up with some professional development for our faculty on how we can address this question. And so the theory behind this is from the National Equity Project. So we have to the left the map of systemic oppression. And so it looks at the individual, interpersonal, structural, institutional forms of oppression. And then to the left of that, we have uh, a partial map of liberation and looks at forms of liberation in those same categories. And then in between, so what my research ended up being was uh, assessing tools like design thinking. Um, and what I thought was, I was like, oh, these creative problem solving tools that I'm aware of that I've been using. I think these can really change the landscape of higher education. That's what I thought when I started my research. I did an intrinsic case study with multi mixed methods. What I ended up writing was a critique of frameworks like this because one, they assume that you start from a blank slate, which is just not true. Like any creative team or any committee or any task force or any department first starts from their individual identities, and they bring with those identities certain assets and certain bias. And then the other thing that it looked at was empathy. And another flaw with a lot of these creative frameworks that talk about empathy is they don't address the question of empathy for who. And so a lot of times in many of these creative problem solving frameworks, the majority is who you're designing for. And in my kind of culture driven approach, the majority is going to be okay. And in fact, the majority is going to benefit from what gets designed for marginalized groups. For example, with the Americans with Disabilities Act, like all of us benefit from elevators, all of us benefit from ramps. You know what I mean? And so you don't necessarily have to be a part of a certain group, uh, of the majority group, and then get neglected because focus is being put on equity for another group. So that's another problem is when, as designers, when we say empathy, oftentimes I question empathy for who. So what I ended up doing, and what you're seeing on the screen is where I started with my research on creating this course that I'm going to talk about. I took a bunch of um, DEI courses on teaching and inclusion. I had to take like 7 or 8 of them, some of the top courses at the time, including some of the courses from Dr. J. Luke Wood, if you're familiar with his work. And what ended up happening was I kind of put this brainstorm together, and the outline on the bottom, the flow on the bottom that you see is like one of the first flows for the course. And so what I did to create that is I met with a bunch of stakeholders from our campus, faculty, administrators, students, staff members, and just interviewed them about what do they think would help address inequity in the classroom, and how do they hear about inequity in the classroom persisting. And so at the end of all those interviews, it had to be like 30 interviews. I came up with this outline. So I went back to the same 30 people and I got their feedback on the outline, and it just went through multiple changes. So what we ended up coming up with was this challenge question: how might we change pedagogical approaches to address the institutional oppression and mistreatment of students from historically oppressed groups within the CSU system? And then the solution was a cross campus collaborative community of practice. And so essentially what we were trying to address is in our system, we were just seeing, a lot of gaps in equity in terms of academic performance. And then we already had societal gaps in terms of a majority of our students were Pell eligible, but Pell eligible students weren't achieving at the same level as their counterparts. And so this is what ended up happening with our first cohort on our campus was prior to taking the course, 58% of faculty were aware of statistical inequities at Fresno. And then after 100% of participants were aware of statistical inequities, 25% of faculty had a regular practice of viewing institutional data. And then after 89% of participants committed to regular practice moving forward. And then 50% felt they had the tools to address inclusion in the classroom. And afterwards, 77% felt like they had the tools necessary to address inequities in the classroom. So after we ran our pilot on our campus, the California State University system took notice, and they were interested in figuring out how we could scale it. So on our campus, it was a synchronous experience. Well, it was an in-person experience. So the community practice met uh, once a month, and in between they had modules and content that they went through. Um, but it was in person, and so now we had to figure out how do we move this to a complete online experience. So we did get grant funding to scale it in the spring of 2022. And I love this quote by Margaret Mead: never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. And so I think our initial meetings with the chancellor's office for the CSU system was just 3 of us. And we met for about a month and a half every week, just trying to figure out like how exactly can we structure this, how can we approach this. So the goals that we had in mind were to increase the number of instructors assessing course and section level data immediately and over time, to scale support and structures for individuals and departments to review, discuss, and understand data and equity gaps, to develop cohorts of equity-minded data stewards and facilitators of discussion around equity, and also to increase faculty uptake of equitable practices. And so the theory of change framework that we worked from was long-term faculty professional learning, engagement with data. So a lot of faculty that come into the community of practice, they're not. So as a student affairs practitioner, when I was in student affairs, we didn't have grades that we gave students. So our metrics were retention rates, graduation rates, attrition, and so we were always looking at that data and aware of that data and trying to design interventions to impact that data. What I found with a lot of faculty, because they're so uh, in uh, in the trenches with grading and assessment of students in the short span of the semester, they weren't aware of a lot of the institutional data. And not that they needed to be experts or not that they needed to have that data in mind as some type of goal, but the awareness of, are you aware of how much Southeast Asian students are struggling on your campus? Are you aware how much um, Black students are struggling on your campus? And then knowing that when you see folks and they are present in your classroom, that there are some equitable decisions that you can make as far as your content and curriculum. And then we looked at change in institutional practices, so equipping professors with strategies and tools, and moving from theory to action to action to theory. And I'll explain the action to theory uh, aspect of the community practice as we go along. And then ultimately close equity gaps, so ongoing evaluation of practices, consistent review of data, and continuous improvement to what's going on in the classroom. So here are the core skills that faculty get out of the community practice. So we go through mapping identities and systems of oppression. We explore thin and thick data. So when they get exposed to the institutional data, um, of course, when you and you'll probably think back to if you looked at your institutional data for the first time, it's just overwhelming. It's like, okay, there's a lot going on, and there's a lot wrong, and what are we supposed to do? And so immediately when we get into these committee spaces or grant cycles, we immediately go to, oh, we need to solve the problem. And so a design approach would be, no, you acknowledge the data and then you want to explore the problem. And so if you have a problem with women persisting in STEM or even getting access to STEM majors, why is that? And so you go into interviewing, and we're not talking about just qualitative Likert scale data, because that type of data is often compartmentalized and um, primed for people to respond. We're talking about interviewing. So going out and interviewing students on why is there a lack of representation of women in the STEM field on your campus specifically, and just getting some of their stories and insights around how they persisted as a student in that major, or why they didn't go into a STEM major. And that practice is called interviewing for empathy. And that's how we collect a lot of the thick data for the community of practice. We do interviews with student services practitioners because they are often loaded with stories of what's going on for students in the classroom or how students perceive the classroom. And then we do interviews of students, and we teach those skills to faculty. And then we teach them the skill of prototyping for change. And so oftentimes it's the case that we design course elements in a bubble, um, and then we try it out the next semester. And if it doesn't work, we go back to the drawing board, try something different. So prototyping for change is, okay, let's not overwhelm ourselves by fully designing something. Let's just create a very quick prototype, even if that's like sketching a new attendance policy out on a napkin, and let's engage students in testing that prototype and validating the design or invalidating it and giving us feedback on what might be better. And that is a key component of co-creating pedagogy and curriculum. Okay.
Could I ask a question?
You were breaking up a bit. I couldn't hear you.
Can you type your question into the chat? Because we can't hear you.
Sorry. Just continue. I'm sorry.
Okay. And so what I want to do now is a bit of identity mapping for those who feel comfortable and safe enough to do so. So in the chat, if you could put an identity that you hold where you have been historically oppressed. So like for me, I would say being Black, I have experienced a ton of oppression. And then an identity that you hold where you have experienced privilege or where you hold privilege. And so for me, I could say being an older professional at my institution, like that's a status thing, right? Or I could say being a man, like in terms of sex and gender, that is a dominant group. And so those will be my two. So if you're willing to share in the chat a group that you hold that you've been oppressed in, and a group where you hold some privilege. And so this is just a demonstration of some of the conversations that we have in the community of practice at the very start. So we first start within our own community. What are our identities? What does that mean for how we show up to different spaces? And then we go into the institutional data piece and some of the institutional inequities before we get to the solutions. So if you're willing to share, go ahead and pop those into the chat. And then as y'all are doing that, we'll move on. Thank you, Irina. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Kristen. And so I'm glad abilities have come up. I'm glad gender has come up because we hold so many identities and there's so many intersections to the identities that we hold, right? And so mapping that out for your teams, your departments, your classroom, oftentimes can be a huge help for creating a brave space, and then also for realizing, okay, as a group, where do we have bias? So for us, like, so if we were all going to get together to solve a problem in higher education, it would be inequitable of us to, as diverse as we are in this Zoom room, it will be inequitable for us to now say, okay, now we're ready to start creating solutions just because we're a diverse group, right? So who's not here, right? And if we don't have any indigenous folks in our group, how are we really going to make strong considerations for them? If we don't have trans folks in our group, how are we really going to make informed decisions for them? And so we have to consider that, right? And then another layer that we're all working within as well is a larger societal context and an institutional context. And so that's where systems mapping comes in. And so the way systems mapping works, and this is one of the skills that we introduce, is we look at behaviors on the top of the iceberg, the things that we can see, right? And you can see from the graphic, calling on specific students more than other types of students, reaching out only to students who are struggling, not learning students' names, language we use in classrooms, typically requiring students to provide lengthy explanations. I think that had to do with attendance. So then below those behaviors, right? So those can be behaviors from faculty, or those could be the behaviors of students. A student that's always arriving late. Just any behaviors that you notice in the classroom space or that you perpetuate in the classroom space. Below that is structures, right? So what structures enable those behaviors? It could be the notion of traditional college students or quote unquote good students, and expecting everybody to fit into this umbrella of what a good student is. It could be lack of outreach to specific groups of students. So women's barriers to STEM education, we all are working from this bias that men are more interested in science, to put it politely, right? Which is just not true. And so we're working from that framework when we're going out and we're doing outreach and we're suggesting majors and we're advising students, we work from that bias. Certain majors attract males more than females. That's a structure that's in place. A structure could be a policy. It could be a societal expectation. It could be an institutional expectation. It could be an institutional requirement. And then it goes, the layer deeper is mindset. So those behaviors and those structures, they typically give us a certain mindset, like as an individual, right? And the mindset could be STEM is just too oppressive for my women students, and I'm not going to encourage them to come into STEM. So I'm going to make the decision for them because of these behaviors and structures. And then my mindset is now, it's too toxic of an environment, and I'm going to make that choice for my students, right? And so now I'm not pushing women into STEM, or I'm not encouraging it. It could be I have this bias in my classroom that um, that Black students don't are facing stereotype threat, and so I don't want to call on them because I know how that felt as a Black student. I'm not going to call on them. I'm going to call on other students. That again is a core mindset that I might be operating from that's problematic. And so structures is what structures in the classroom, at the institution, in the system hold those behaviors in place, and then what mindsets do we have as individuals that inform our bias to remain complicit in the structure resulting in the behavior. And one mindset that is common that we find in our community practice is, I am being oppressed myself as a faculty, as a non-cisgender. Like, I have faculty tell me all the time, as a non-cisgender faculty in my department, as the only one, I'm constantly fielding microaggressions and all that. And so now my mindset is, this department doesn't care about our students. And so how can I possibly put students in this space? And so it could go both ways, right? It could be a mindset of oppression or a mindset of internalized oppression that we then project onto students. So these are a couple of excerpts from the community of practice that I thought might give you some more insight into how a lot of these mechanisms work. So with identity mapping, someone said, in recognizing my own identity as a junior white cisgender female faculty member, I wonder what would happen if I and all faculty prioritize BIPOC faculty members' sense of belonging rather than focusing on our own sense of safety and belonging in the space. So that's kind of they started to think about their allyship as a result of doing some identity mapping. Data is a tool. You hear stats about graduation or retention, but looking at them for yourself in the context of your practice is truly enlightening. You really start to pick up on the contributing themes from your own class. Interviewing for empathy. One student I interviewed was disappointed that a professor did not care about their health after a car accident and denied extending a deadline. Felt the professor should have an awareness of the many roles people play outside of class. Prototyping for change. One student I interviewed was disappointed that a professor did not care about their. I'm sorry, I didn't put the right one there. I will provide the correct excerpt and then send it to you all. The excerpt that I wanted to provide was there was an art and design faculty who prototyped uh, getting rid of the textbook in their classroom. And what they did was they provided their current reading list, and then they went out and they wanted to have a more inclusive reading list, considering so they were a graphic design faculty, and they thought that their textbook was very Eurocentric, and so they wanted to instead provide some articles, artifacts, and things like that to replace the textbook completely. And when they showed just based on titles, when they showed the students these two lists, they did an A/B test. The students more gravitated, no matter what identity group they were part of, they more gravitated to the more equitable kind of authorship or more representative authorship than the previous textbook provided. And this was that faculty. They did some other things as well. They updated their syllabus to an accessible format. They updated their content, like I was talking about. They updated language and policies based on equity-minded pedagogy. Uh, they did a design history zine to replace exams. Uh, Student-led reading discussions to empower students and offer all students space to speak. And then grade distribution was only in percentage rather than points for clarity. If you can, I want you to scan this QR code. And for those who cannot, earlier I put a link in the chat that I'm going to copy and paste. That I'm trying to copy and paste. Okay, here we go. Okay. So this is a link to a Jedi compendium. This one of the tools in there is this tool that I created for this community of practice. Well, actually, not even for this community of practice. I created this for a colleague of mine. So when I took this instructional design position, I had a colleague, Dr. Raymar Henderson, who's currently teaching at CSU LA. We had been doing some work together on our campus, called the Barbershop Talks for Black and Brown Men on campus. And so we were familiar with each other from that space. He had heard I was moving into this position, so he connected with me probably about a week into when I became an instructional designer. I was like, "Hey, I'm wondering if you can look at my syllabi because I just want to be sure. I have some concerns about whether I'm being equitable and inclusive to my students. And so I want you to look at my syllabi and just give me a fair kind of evaluation, you know." And so he sent me a syllabi. Before I looked at him, I was like, how do I approach this? And so I went and I started reading literature on inclusive syllabi, a lot of studies on punishing and rewarding language. I started looking for tools and rubrics. Um, oh, thank you, Peter. I'm sorry if that link did not work. Let me see if I just want to test the one you sent as well. Yes, thank you so much, Peter. I appreciate it. Oh, okay. You sent the direct one. Got it. And so my colleague so I read literature on punishing rewarding language and various aspects of what makes an inclusive syllabi, race consciousness. And then I found a few tools that through the Center for Urban Education at USC. They had one, the Spark Lab at Stanford. They had one as well. And so, um, but the downside was those tools were giving recommendations for what you put in your syllabus, but they didn't have any type of assessment or evaluation tool. And so I created that based on the literature that I got. I used it with my colleague. He thought it was an amazing experience, gave me some feedback on it, and then I've been using it with faculty ever since who want to address inclusion and equity in the classroom and getting feedback on it. And so hopefully it's a tool that you can make use of. I wanted to leave y'all with something today. Um, and that is all I have. And I would like to take any questions you might have of me at this time.
Thank you, William, oh, sorry, can you hear me okay? This is Peter.
Yep.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, William, for your presentation and your work. It's really interesting. I had a question about something that you said before spurred a question for me, which is you mentioned that experiences that you create for marginalized students can help everybody. And I'm wondering if you can comment at all about the reverse situation that I've seen. We teach a course that is about equity, and I've noticed that and it's for faculty, and I've noticed that our faculty of color who come into the course kind of respond to it a lot differently from our white majority faculty. And so I'm curious to know if you have any experience with sort of differentiated approaches that can work with different populations, or whether it makes more sense for everybody to be in the same space having kind of like responding to the same materials really differently, whether that's preferable to having like differentiated experiences. Does that make sense?
What's the material? Like, what's the topic that they take?
It's about belonging and equity, and sort of access for online students. It's a course that tries to help faculty be mindful of the issues that go into those topics.
Got it.
And then
So
oh, sorry, William. So then our students of color, or our faculty of color who come into that have a completely different experience, life experience, professional experience with those issues. It's not a mainstream experience, and so I think they respond to the issues there differently from the white faculty who are the majority, faculty there.
yeah, oftentimes, so like I come into spaces in this type of work, and it's hard because we see a lot of bad examples in the media, especially the past 10 years. But I don't come into those spaces to teach. And I think oftentimes we might, like, even if that's like, if people don't understand what internalized depression is, like, I don't stand up there and me announce like this is what it is. We can go and explore and investigate and discuss. But I as a cisgender male am not going to be a figurehead to stand here and tell you how you should be serving students from the LGBTQ plus community. And so that would be my suggestion, is that y'all figure out how to make that space a bit more dynamic in terms of how the message is disseminated. Because I think there's a lot of value to the disagreement and how people look at it differently. And you probably just want to start to highlight that as opposed to not have it at all.
Got it. Okay, thank you very much.
And someone asked Herman, is it Herman, German? How do you pronounce your name?
Yeah, yes, German.
Okay. You asked the question about the thing about the napkin thing. So Prototyping for change is, and if you, I'll put my email in the chat. If you email me, I'll send you a lot more on this. But so basically, there was a study that was done by Dow and Clemmer, and it was on the egg drop test. And I don't know if any of y'all have ever seen the egg drop test, but you have to like drop an egg from a high distance and have it land safely without cracking. And so a lot of people will come up with like basket concepts or parachute concepts. There's a million ways you can do it to where the egg doesn't crack. And so in the study, there was one group, they had 55 minutes total to build a vehicle that wouldn't crack the egg. And so they, sketched things out, planned, did what they needed to do, and then they tested, and some of them cracked, some of them didn't. There was an experimental group, and they got the benefit of iteration. And so they got to test with actual eggs. So they got a total of 5 eggs, not including the one that they would use in the actual test. And so you can tell where this is going. The folks that were able to fail early did better in the actual outcome of designing something that wouldn't crack an egg. And so that's what prototyping is all about. And so rather than me rewriting my whole syllabus, or if I want to change an exam because it's not working for students, rather than me creating a whole new exam, I might have an idea of, oh, if I change the questions to be more like this, or if I change the format to be more like this, then I can represent in 3 questions and get feedback from students, as opposed to me like spending all semester redesigning something with no validation and then testing it the next semester and figuring out while actually using it that it doesn't work. And so that was the napkin analogy, is like, how do you prototype something so that students can validate it sooner? And then let me put my email in the chat.
That'd be great. Thank you, everyone. I've put a few little announcements in the chat for you. You can find the recordings to this session and all sessions. And there's social media links, and then the program so that you can see what's next and the next couple of days. So this session is officially over. Irina, if you want to go ahead and ask your question, we can keep it brief, but we do need to transition to the next session, so we can go another minute or two. So go ahead, William, up to you.
Oh, yep.
A very quick question. In terms of the equity, like-minded pedagogy, and of course there's many different strategies, but also in terms of the deadlines, would you say that like being flexible with deadlines is something that is part of equity, and because I've heard different things about it, but in my own experience, I kind of practice flexibility with deadlines for everyone. But any thoughts about that?
Yeah. So what I typically ask a group of faculty is, have you ever got an extension on like a proposal or a grant or something that you needed to file? And most of us are going to say, yeah, sure. And so that's the answer. if you say like, you know what, I'm not gonna file for that $300,000 grant because I didn't submit it on time and I shouldn't benefit from an extension, or would you take the extension? So that's the answer.
Great. Well, thank you so much for this session. It's so important and inspiring too for all of us. I know from the community college level, would love to see more of this these kinds of programs available to instructors throughout. So really fantastic. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording, and we can hang out here for the next session.